Hey folks, I've had a couple of questions recently around checkout and how to use the client reference ID in particular and how that flows from the client through Stripe and through the webhook handler back to your webhook. A couple questions about just like setting up the webhook handler in general, and those have been in PHP. So today I wanted to just like do a super quick video where we're going to set up a PHP backend and a very simple client to show how to pass that client reference ID in checkout through to your webhook handler. So let's jump into some code here. I'm going to make the client a directory for a client and a directory for a server, and I'm just going to start with very basic client index.html that will be blank, and server.php, which will also be blank. Okay, I'm going to use a little bit of tmux, split the screen here. And the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to install, with Composer, I'm going to install the Stripe PHP library and also Slim 3.2, which is going to be our web framework. And then I'm going to use .env, php.env from vlucas as to manage my environment variables. So as that's installing, I'll come over here and open up my client here. Okay, it's a blank HTML file. Actually, let's make this start off with demo. Okay. And then I'm really just going to follow the guide here for checkout. So we'll start with recurring payments, and we're going to start a subscription. Yeah, so this is how it's going to work. Step one is going to be, we're going to have some plans and products, which we've already created in our dashboard. The plan is called Starter. So I'm kind of just going to gloss over this step one. You can go check it out in your dashboard. You can go create products and plans. So our plan has the ID Starter. We're going to use that. So jumping into step two here, it says create a checkout session on your server. So we could optionally create this session on our server. I'm actually going to do this on the client. The question was more about setting this up on the client. So I'm going to use the client-only integration here for recurring payments. Going down here to creating that. Wow, recurring payments here. Okay, so this is how this works. So we want to redirect to checkout when a button is clicked. So we're going to add a button here. It's going to have an ID checkout button. And we're going to say checkout. I'm just going to say checkout. Okay. And then instead of having a SKU, we're going to use a plan. We're going to use starter. Okay. And this is going to pass forward the customer at email address. Now the question here was, how do I pass a client reference ID from the front end and receive that in my webhook handler on the back end? So the client reference ID is something you can pass here. And this could be a string, this could be some value, it could be, like the ID of the user in your database or something. So here we're just going to say like my test ref ID. Okay, so we're looking for this coming back in our webhook handler. All right, so let's grab reference to this checkout button. Checkout button, and when it's clicked, we want to actually do this redirect to checkout stuff. Okay, and then if there for some reason there's an error, we'll console log the error or the result here. All right, so now we should have at least a button that we can click and it's going to redirect to checkout, but we don't actually have a server yet that we can use. So let's go to our server. All right, so this was the front end stuff. We're mostly done with that. We'll go to the back end. Okay, we're going to use .env to manage our environment variables, and we're going to use a Slim app. Okay, and what we want to say here is the very first thing we want to do is just like make sure that we can get the client HTML page. I'm gonna actually kill that. And okay. So to start up the server, I'm gonna say php-s localhost 4242 server.php. That's actually roughly the right thing. For some reason, using index.php works a little better. Okay, so now we have local. Let's go check this out and see if it's working. Let me show you the browser. Okay, so in the browser we have a checkout button. And when we click on the checkout button, we should be redirected to the checkout page, and we're not. So let's see if there's any errors. The way that we can look and see if there's errors in the client is we right click and say inspect element or inspect. Okay, this opens the Chrome console. I'm using Google Chrome here. And if there is an error, we'll see the error there. We can click on it and it says Stripe is not defined. Okay, Stripe is not defined. So this is the first step in debugging, is like look and see what the errors are. So we click on this, nothing's happening. It's because Stripe is not defined. So we need to go back into our code for the client and make sure that Stripe is defined. So here we are using Stripe redirect to checkout, but we're not actually using, we haven't included Stripe.js yet. So we'll include that, refresh the page, clear our errors, refresh. Click on checkout. Stripe is still not defined. So I included Stripe.js, but didn't actually fire it up. Okay, so now we have included it and initialized it. Refresh the page. And, okay, sorry. Browser, back to the browser. Okay, refresh, click on checkout. And now we're being redirected to the checkout page here. Put in some test card details and hit submit. And now the checkout is processing and we're redirecting back to our page, or to the success URL that we used on the client. So that is looking good. Now we need to figure out how to handle this client reference ID coming back to our system. So this is going to be done by using a webhook. So we want to pull up the webhook, Stripe webhook setup. And we're using PHP today. And let's see. So yeah, so this code here, if you just copy and paste this code, it gets us pretty close. In a Slim app, it looks a little differently because we need to create our own URL here. And we're just going to send back like message, okay. And that did not paste well. Okay, this is missing a close bracket. All right, so this is just the code that we copy and pasted from the Stripe webhook handler. So let's go through this line by line and talk about what each thing does. By default, Slim app has some methods that help us get the body and construct an event from the body. So we're not going to actually use this file get contents because we are using Slim's post request handler. So we'll remove that. We'll call the payload just request.body, request.getBody. And we're going to construct the event from that. Okay, so now if the event is constructed successfully, that means that we were able to parse the post request that came from Stripe to this webhook endpoint. And we're saying handle the response with the 400 and then exit. So in that case, we actually want to, with JSON error And then I believe this is 400 here. Okay. And we're going to handle the event type. So depending on the event type, there are already methods that are implemented here that are being made. They were like in the documentation, but they're not actually implemented for you. So it's expected that you would write your own handle payment intent succeeded method. So here we're actually just going to comment these out. In fact, we're going to delete all this because we only want to handle checkout.session.completed. And in the case that checkout session completed happened, what we're really interested in is looking at the event. So we want to just like console log that event or log it to the server log here. Okay. And then if for some reason it did not fail, event not handled. Okay. All right, so I think this is roughly what we're looking at doing. Now, with the Stripe CLI, we can test this out. So we can say Stripe listen forward to Stripe listen forward to localhost webhook. What did we call it? Webhooks or webhook? We called it webhook. Okay, so now we're forwarding events to the webhook. Stripe listen webhook. All right, and this is going to be our webhook secret that we could use for webhook, like verifying the authenticity of our webhook. If you want more information about like how to set up webhook handlers, we did that in another episode, but this is really just to show you how the webhook event is passed through. So I have 2 of those. All right. So here we can do Stripe trigger checkout.session.completed. It's going to create a bunch of resources for us and trigger a checkout session completed event. And you'll see here that our server is now handling these different events, including this checkout session completed event. So this was one of the many events that we're handling. Okay. And if we look in our server log here, you'll see that we did print out one event, and the event ID is here. And if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, we see that the type of the event was a checkout session completed event. We should. Where did that go? Type. Where is the type? Yes, here. Checkout session completed. Okay. So that is just one way to test, is using Stripe listen and Stripe trigger. So the listener forwards the webhook events that are being sent by Stripe to our system, and it lets us forward those to our local development machine. And then Stripe trigger lets us trigger those events without actually having to go through the checkout. So let's look at this in a little bit more depth, or a little bit more completely. So from the front end, I can show you what this looks like. So if we've got our server going here. Let's move back to the browser, and I'll show you this from scratch. So localhost 4242. When we click the checkout button, we will be redirected to the Stripe hosted checkout page. We fill in our information, and remember, sorry, let's take a step back. So in the sources for creating our redirect to checkout, right? So when we click this button, we're using Stripe's redirect to checkout function, and we're passing this client reference ID of my test reference ID. Okay. So if I put a breakpoint there, I can click on the line number and that adds a breakpoint. So when I click checkout, it breaks on that line, and then I can use these tools over here to like step over a line or into a line. So I'm gonna step over the line and I can kind of like walk through the function as it's happening. But I know that right here, we're gonna redirect to another page. So I'm just gonna click play, and we are looking for, again, this client reference ID to be passed back to us in the webhook handler. So we're going to click play here and fill out our details. Click subscribe. We're subscribing to some monthly starter plan. And then if we look back at our server log, okay, this is where we're going to be waiting to receive a webhook event for a checkout session completed, and it looks like we did. So now if we scroll up within this event data, we should see the client reference ID, and we do. So here is my test ref ID. This is the client reference ID that came from the front end. Okay. So this is how the client reference ID is passed from the back end to the front end. Now, well, let's keep that going. So a couple of questions. All right. If you were to, instead of commenting out, or if you were to use like handle, checkout, let's see, in the docs, right, we have this recurring payments, starting a subscription. We say handle the webhook completed event. How do we show you how to do this? After the payment, maybe? We should have, okay. So here we have an example of how to complete or how to set up the webhook handler, right? And here in the webhook handler code, we say fulfill the purchase, and we have this handle checkout session. So let's say that we copied this content directly from here, right? And so we know that our code is making it into, oh, I'm sorry, you weren't looking at the browser. So in the after the payment section of the checkout docs, there's a section here for setting up the webhook handler. And down in the webhook handler, we say break out the session from the event data and then fulfill the purchase by passing the session to this handle checkout session function. But it turns out this handle checkout session function is not defined. So if we just copied that and pasted it here, instead of actually like implementing that handle checkout session function, I want to show you what happens. Okay, so if we were to just copy and paste it directly from, copy and paste the webhook handler directly from the documentation, this is what would happen. We would, when we complete our checkout, it's going to throw a 500 error because that function is not defined. That handle checkout function, it's just it's like a placeholder. It's expected that you as the developer would fill that in with the logic that takes the client reference ID and does something with it. Okay, so here we're completing the processing, and then we'll go back over to the code, and we do see that this threw a 500 response, right? So that 500 response, if we were to log into our dashboard, we would be able to see that in our dashboard too. And let me just show you that here. So pull up the browser. Okay, so if we go to our events or our webhooks, and we pulled up the webhook event for checkout session completed, you'll see that it's failing, but also Let's see. Okay, sorry. Go back to the events, filter it by the type of checkout.session.completed. Okay, checkout session was completed. It's failing to this one because I don't have ngrok set up anymore. But the one that we really care about is the one that's going to Stripe CLI because that's what we're testing with. And you'll see that it's responding with a 500 internal server error. And that lines up with what we're seeing in our server logs, right? So like in the server log here, we are like crashing, and this is a big, long, nasty error from line 36, which is telling us here that there is no function defined for message call to undefined function handle checkout session. So it's attempting to call handle checkout session, which was in our documentation, but is really just a placeholder. Sorry. So here, here in the server logs, this is where we're looking. Message call to undefined function handle checkout session right there at the top of that function. So the problem here is that in the documentation, we give you a call to this handle checkout session function, but this function is something that you have to define yourself to pull out the client reference ID if that's what you're using, and like actually use that to fulfill the purchase. So here instead you might either like go down and define a function that does this, or alternatively you might just say like let's debug like we're just going to print out to the console session, and I believe this is going to be client reference ID. Okay. Note that this is only in the case of the checkout session completed event type. If you have another event type that you're handling here, maybe like charge.succeeded, the charge.succeeded event doesn't contain the client reference ID. The way that we know that is based on the type of event. So here, the type of event is a charge succeeded, and the base of that type is charge. So the data that's going to be included in the charge succeeded event is the charge data. Here in the checkout session completed event, the data that's included is going to be a checkout session. So if we go over to the API reference back in the browser here, we pull up the API reference for checkout session. Sorry. Here, pull up checkout session. No. Okay, so the session object is what's coming back when a checkout.session.completed event happens. The data that's coming back is a checkout session completed, is a session object, and the session object has a client reference ID. This was the ID that we used when we passed it from the client forward. We are not passing the client reference ID as part of a charge, because a charge object is what's included. The charge object is what's included in charge.succeeded, and the charge object does not have a client reference ID. So because the charge object doesn't have a client reference ID, if we were listening for charge.succeeded, that's not going to have the ID that we're looking for. Okay. So it's really important that we're picking the right event type here and listening to checkout session completed and handling the fulfillment of that purchase with checkout session completed, because that's where we're going to have the client reference ID. All right. So now that we have refreshed this, what we're looking for now is to see in the server log that that client reference ID is output. So if we go back, yeah, so this is the checkout session completed event. We're expecting this client reference ID to be logged to the server log when the checkout session completes. I'm just going to go back through the flow again on the browser and let you watch the server log here. So I clicked checkout, and then I'm going through the whole process of paying, okay, clicking subscribe, and now we're going to see some events come through. Okay, undefined property of Stripe charge client reference ID. That's because we attempted to access client reference ID on the charge, but it wasn't there. So now we printed null, and now we're printing out my ref ID. This first error is because in that case statement we didn't put any content for the charge that succeeded, but we are indeed printing out my test ref ID, which is the client reference ID from the checkout client. So hopefully this was helpful. Yeah, again, passing the client reference ID through a couple of keys. One, the method that's defined in the docs, or that is called in the docs, it's invoked, handle, checkout session, is not actually defined anywhere. So you would have to define and implement that method yourself. Or you can just kind of like delete it and replace the content of that webhook handler with your own logic for dealing with the client reference ID. The other thing is that the client reference ID is only available on the checkout session object. It's not on the charge succeeded. It's not on any other object. So you will want to make sure that you're listening for the checkout session completed event type. Cool. All right. That's it for today.